It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, who will talk about the Woman Today journal from prior to the Second World War, from 1936 to 1940, and the Popular Front strategy. Her name is Stanislava Barać, and she is a senior research associate at the Institute for Literature and Art in Belgrade. She's author of more than 50 articles in scholarly journals and edited collections. She herself has 2 monographs. One is about the periodical from the avant-garde Yugoslav period in 1920s, and the other is about women periodicals, also in the interwar era. And she also co-edited 4 collective volumes. They're all on different periodicals, as for example, the Russian Archive magazine, also from the interwar period. Then she also co-edited a book on children's periodicals in former 2 Yugoslavias, as well as a collection of essays on the First World War and Slavic literatures. And the last one from the previous year is called the magazine Woman Today, The Enlightenment for the Revolution. And I just want to mention that this talk will be around 45 minutes, and you are free to ask questions. If you are following us on YouTube, please use the chat function. And if you are with us on Zoom, post your questions on Q&A. So without much ado, Stana, please take over.
Thank you, Alexander. Well, I tried to organize today's talk about Woman Today magazine and its contextualization within Popular Front strategy into 2 parts. First, I will list the main notions and concepts I will use in the discussion, and most of them are, in fact, historical phenomena and concepts that name these phenomena, and at the first glance they seem self-evident. But in short, I will explain which aspects of the Popular Front strategy is important for this particular topic. In this regard, I will also really shortly explain the socio-political context of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, the main facts needed for the topic. That will lead me to the second part of the lecture or talk, and that is the interpretation of selected traits of Woman Today magazine. That also leads us, of course, to the widest methodological question, why the Woman Today and Popular Front has relevance for us today. And I will answer it immediately. If you consider, as I do, that most of contemporary world crises are produced because of prevalency of neoconservative ideologies, then maybe we have some models, some inspiring examples from the past how to overcome it, or at least how to try to overcome it. And in a more narrow methodological sense, this talk aims to show the advantages of periodical studies as a discipline, or better say, sub-discipline or interdiscipline within the humanities. So maybe now it's the moment to include the presentation. And it is, here it is. Concepts we have to bear in mind today are women's movements and their history, feminisms in plural, anti-fascism, communism, Popular Front as defined in Spain, France, Great Britain, and within the Communist International, mass movements, women's autonomy, that would be an important notion, the Women's Anti-Fascist Front of Yugoslavia, and finally, the social revolution. First of all, we have to mention that Popular Front strategy started to develop even before the Popular Front was officially established either as a movement or political coalition in different countries or internationally, which mostly happened in 1935, as we know. And even before that, that's important, in Spain, there was an anarcho-syndicalist movement and organization that will become the part of Popular Front in 1936 as a political coalition. But before that, it was separate organization established in the first decade of the 20th century. And one of the main ideas of this organization, as Martha Acklenberg summarizes, was that revolutionary movements can develop effectively only if they speak to the specific realities of people's lives. And with this belief, women within this movement established their own autonomous organization, Mujeres Libres, in 1936, although some men in the roof organization were against it. And they established the magazine of the same name, and it was similar to Women Today we are talking about today. The idea of these women was that women need separate spaces to pay special attention to the realities of their own subordination, because it's different than the class subordination of men, and because, in their own words, women suffer and thus must end triple enslavement to ignorance, to capital, and to men. And so that was much before the Popular Front was established in Spain. Then, as we all know, in France, in the middle of the 30s, Popular Front aroused as a mass movement and also as a political coalition, which won the elections in 1936. And for my topic, one definition of Popular Front is important. It's in the program, in the statute of Popular Front in France. And it says, as we can see, that Popular Front is neither the party nor the super party. It is a center of connections between the organizations and groups which, while preserving their autonomy, united for joint action with an aim to coordinate anti-fascist forces in the country, that specific country. But I just want to notice, and you to notice how decentralizing this idea of Popular Front was, which we can read from these stressed words. And of course, as we all know, a year before that in Moscow, important thing happened, the 7th Congress of the Communist International, of the Third International. And the most important thing about that Congress is that they accepted the idea, the strategy of Popular Front, and elaborated it in more details in connection with happenings in Europe. And two speeches, two reports or articles of Georgy Dimitrov are important in that sense. One has the title, The Popular Front, and the other has a more complicated title, and it sounds The Fascist Offensive and the Task of the Communist International in the Struggle of the Working Class Against Fascism. And then again, among other things, for me, there especially I will put stress on one part when he elaborates that now working class has to work together with peasantry and also with petit bourgeois masses of the towns. And these masses, and I would say the masses, must be taken as they are and not as we should like to have them. For me, this sentence is particularly important because this simply meant that Popular Front strategy used the popular culture of these groups, and they also wanted to invent ways to produce a new popular and mass culture for the masses. And this sentence discovers and illustrates well Popular Front policy and strategy as a top-down and vice versa policy in the same time, top-down and down-top. And that's, for me, the beauty of this strategy. And what does it mean? The initiative for cultural and political activities used to come from both the top of the parties or organizations, hierarchies, but it was also coming from the bottom or from the margin for marginalized groups or from the masses themselves. And that's the point about Popular Front strategy. Now, when we talk about Yugoslav case, about Yugoslavia, first Yugoslavia, the Communist Party of Yugoslavia became the main force that conducted this policy. But there's one specificity about Communist Party in the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovens in comparison with other communist parties, because Communist Party of Yugoslavia was forbidden in the same year it was established in 1920. So in that same year, it had great success at local elections in many towns, important towns, and in the capital city, in Belgrade, success in organizing strikes, etc. So the king forbid the party at the end of the year. And as we know, after that, all the party's activities were developed illegally and were underground. And that was like that for many years. And then the new Communist Party of Yugoslavia policy in the middle of the 30s, according to the new policy of the Third International, required, among other, three things that are important for women today. One is they required of their members and sympathizers involvement in already existing legal organizations. As a second thing, they required the establishment of totally new legal forms of work, and they asked their members and sympathizers whatever they do to address a wide audience, as much wide as they could, in order to build a mass anti-fascist coalition. And our magazine, today's Woman Today, was one of the results of this new Communist Party of Yugoslavia policy, because as one, young women communists formed a youth section within the most important Yugoslav feminist organization, the Women's Movement, which was already existing legal organization. Then these women, girls and young women, established a new and legal form of work. And this magazine, Žena, Danas, Woman Today, is that new and legal form of work. The first members of the youth section overlapped with the editorial staff of the Woman Today. That's interesting to say. And as a third thing, of course, Woman Today was intended for a wide female audience, and for that reason, given in a genre of an illustrated magazine. But what I want to stress here is that it was not just the direct result of the Third International and Communist Party of Yugoslavia strategy, because young women communists had their own connections to other women's movements, and obviously their autonomy within Communist Party of Yugoslavia. So we can say that they draw the Popular Front strategy from other sources too. These other sources and the international position of women today can be read from only one periodical gesture young female Yugoslav female communist made. And that's why I think periodical studies as a discipline are important for the research of so many things. So from that only one periodical editorial gesture, we can see this editorial stuff of Woman Today, published Gabrielle Deschênes' article, we can see it on the slide, as the first manifesto article of the first issue of the magazine. And Gabrielle Deschênes wrote that introductory article on purpose, especially for the occasion of the entry of Žena, danas. And who Gabrielle Deschênes is, that is the question. She was the initiator and the president of the Women's World Committee Against War and Fascism. It was established in Paris in 1934, together with its organ, also a journal, a magazine, La Femme dans l'Action mondiale. So it was also a monthly illustrated magazine, as Žena, danas will become, Woman Today will become in 2 years. So that was a model for Yugoslav Woman Today. I will also stress that editors put Deschênes' article before their own text and articles in order to position themselves, to be clear with that they want to position themselves in the international left anti-fascist feminist network, which in fact was in the process of being established at that very moment. Women, we can suppose, used connections made with other women at the pacifist international conferences. There was one in Paris in 1934, there was one in Brussels in 1936. And these leftist women continue to cooperate during the late 30s and even after the World War II. Although the Yugoslav Woman Today was, as I said, and to repeat it, officially and by first initiative, the agent of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, it was also that. But thanks to the autonomous editorial decisions of these young women, it developed equally or even more in a sense of autonomous feminist periodical. Yugoslav young communists used given media space, or maybe it's better to say taken media space, in a more feminist direction than maybe their party comrades, comrades expected. And that's in other words, so we can say that in a kind of hybridization of anti-fascism and feminism, Women Today arose and lasted as a part of an autonomous international women's movement, autonomous within the anti-fascist movement and Popular Front. And we can say that its activity began in 1934 with the foundation of this Women's World Committee Against War and Fascism, and it continued through the post-war work of the International Women's Democratic Federation. The continuity is important in this women's movement always, and that's why I stress it. And the thesis about this continuity is the thesis of Isidora Grubački, posted in her study Communism, Left Feminism, and Generation in the 1930s, the case of Yugoslavia. So, Feminist magazine listed here, we can see it on the slide, 7 found so far, but there were more, were the discursive sites or discursive spots of the making of this new feminism or left feminism. That's the best name for it. And these were the sites and we can see it better now how where they were in the world countries. And we suppose there's one in Australia, there was one in Belgium, but we are still looking to see it alive. So they are just the ones I have seen it. So these magazines were the sites where global anti-fascism met with proletarian feminism. But the core of the phenomena is that the site where these two met was also the lives and literary bodies of young communist women and other women too, because their living and working experiences made them make this new global generational movement. And we should remember from Mujeres Libres and the Spanish anarchist movement that living experience is important for succession or success of revolutions or just changes in the society. The Yugoslav woman Today, as well as other magazines, were filled with authentic reportages, readers' letters, testimonies, travelogues. Not all were authentic, in fact, we will see that, but also interviews, short stories in a style of socialist realism. And all these genres and text in these genres transposed different female experiences and, what is even more important, validated them. That was important for the women readers. On a local level now, in Yugoslav case, Yugoslav communists carefully constructed additional mimicry strategies because they had to do, because they were working illegally. And we can say there were maybe 3 strategies connected to Women Today. As one thing, the role of the owner and editor of the magazine used to be officially performed by one of the representatives of the bourgeois class. So a woman, an older woman from a higher class, would put her name on the magazine, that she's the real owner, that it was like a private publication, but it was publication of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, in fact. But whoever played the role of the editor, we could say that, in fact, Mitra Mitrovic, prominent communist, young communist of the time, who got that task from the party to establish the new female feminist magazine, not feminist, women's. That was the task from the party comrades, but they made it feminist. We can say that she was the editor, or at least the responsible editor in this period from 1936 until 1940. Then something else is also important. It's also because of the censorship and possibility of banning this magazine. The discourses, which means ideologies, had to be and were cleverly organized in text and in a magazine as a text in whole. Feminism used to be expressed most explicitly and declaratively. Then pacifism and anti-fascism were equally explicit, but for example, they were not used for self-promotion of the magazine. In editorial articles, in announcements, in advertisements. And finally, of course, communism was expressed indirectly and implicitly. Communism, we can say, was the unsaid ideology of Women Today, which, according to the original idea, should have been a kind of encrypted frame for the discursive shaping of other ideologies. And the result, we could see the result of it, the result of the effects of these discourses and how they were organized, the effects of work of discourses put in such a way was that over time, and by the beginning of the war in Yugoslavia, these readers, but it means real women, were ready for the anti-fascist struggle through which they carried out the communist revolution and implemented into it feminist emancipation. And that's the most beautiful thing here for me, that these women did exactly the thing this magazine educated them to do. That would be the second thing about mimicry strategies. And the third thing is the use of visual materials in the magazine, the visual aspect of the magazine of Women Today especially, and all these popular Frau and feminist magazines are always, were so important. Because the visual aspect was used to express a message which would lead to the ban of Žena, danas by the state censorship if it was formulated textually, which happened with the banning of the 30th issue in the 1940. So images, we can say here on the slide is example of French magazine, La Femme. Images and articles circulated through most of the left feminist magazines, but they were also originally made for Women Today, like the one we can see here in orange colors, my favorite. The importance of the magazine's visual aspects back then was a consequence of at least three editorial necessities. One is, as I mentioned, that visual message would say what textual cannot because of censorship, simply enough. But then they needed communication with the semi-literate audience, and the magazine was meant to be read regularly, of course, if someone's buy it, but also to be read to readers' groups at trade union meetings or in the countryside, where one activist would read, and it was happening in reality, one activist would read and many women would listen and observe. And as a third thing, something happened as a consequence of the first two necessities. Image from the cover page, mostly photo collage or photo montage. Milanka Todić explained that in her research. This image did not have a textual explanation, not even the short legend, as the most cover images had in that period. So the images from the cover page became independent in relation to the text that would explain them. And these images seemed very different in their meaning. For example, for the first issue, we had smiling peasant girls in a wheat field. We have young girls skiing, but we also had those threatening and shocking pictures like this mother worried about the threat of the war. But all these images also, despite looked different sometimes, had a unique semantic base in an already made ideological frame and meanings. And the editors of Women Today believed something. They believed in their readers. They believed that a lot of readers would know how to read exactly, to understand exactly the meaning of the cover image editors wanted to send as a message. So therefore, it could be said that the magazine raised the level of enlightening discourse in the period of periodical history, and also that magazine changed the meaning of the very notion of enlightenment of the reading audience. And more precisely, or in other words, in fact, editors managed to appeal to semi-literate, middle-educated, and highly educated audiences at the same time. That was, as explained, also one of the main Popular Front strategies to unite different groups with the help of a shared coalition frame. And in this sense, coalition frame was the magazine itself. Discursive space was coalition frame. In the mentioned introductory article, Gabrielle Duchesne described the Women's Peace Conference in Brussels, for example, in that manner, as one of these frames. And she said, never before one peace conference included so many classes and groups. It gathered statesmen with the most socially relevant members of small communities, intellectuals with peasants. And she wrote the conclusion from the Women's Peace Conference in Brussels, instruction for women, that women from all countries, of all social classes, of different philosophical principles and different political beliefs, should organize to protect world peace. And throughout the running of Women Today, Yugoslav Women Today, one can see how the magazine was fulfilling this demand. But of course, it couldn't stop the World War II. When we talk about prominent discourses and ideologies and common topics of Women Today, we can notice something, but before that, I just have to list what were the prominent discourses and common topics. These were emancipation, world peace, anti-fascism, the Spanish Civil War, suffrage, discourse of motherhood, trade unionism, etc. And we can notice that some of these topics and discourses belong to what we can say universal feminist discourse, while some of them belong more specifically to the left feminist ideology. And that's also one of the strategies of women's magazine within Popular Front. In order to fulfill the conditions to be seen as usual women's magazine, Women Today, just like the other Popular Front magazines around the world, brought the news from the so-called women's world. And we can divide these news and columns into two groups, serious and entertaining ones. And the most magazines I'm talking about were edited in that way. So they had these serious articles. Of course, they were about women's organizations, suffrage protests, women's human rights, like right to abortion and rights of single unmarried mothers, about anti-war activities, and so on. And in the same time, they were entertaining, or more precisely, educational entertaining news and informations. And that would be information about fashion. For example, Women Today had its fashion column, articles about leisure time, children's upbringing and education, health advice. All of that has Women Today, together with revolutionary discourse and texts with revolutionary discourse. And when we talk finally about that discourse, I will just give some examples, and that will take me to the end of this talk. For the beginning, maybe important is something we can say it's a historical article. There were articles about happenings in history or women from the history that should be the role models for today's young women. And this unsigned article, Women in the French Revolution, it was published in 1939, is based on, for example, Michelet's and Kropotkin's works. And in this article, images of women as a mass and small portraits of individual women revolutionaries are altered throughout the articles. And there are quotes from Kropotkin, and those quotes from Kropotkin describe the women march on Versailles on the 5th of October of 1789 in French Revolution, and it represents women as a conscious mass, conscious group. That's important. The author of the article, we suppose it's Mitra Mitrovic, quoted this. But the author of the article does the same. When later in 1790, the Federation was celebrated, the French Republic was celebrated, the author said, women covered huge distances on foot, many of them with the children in their arms, in order to take part in the celebrations. So to take part in the celebration of the Republic was so important for these French women, who took part in the revolution. But author of the article also reminds the readers that women's struggle, the struggle of these French women, despite all sacrifices, did not bring rights to women, but only to men. And more than that, it reminds readers that women were punished because the convent forbid women's clubs and passed the law to imprison women in life if 5 of them meet on the street. But despite all these facts, the article is so feminist, but the message is that a class revolution must occur. And this article makes such a meaning together with other media discourses. Here is the drawing, Kete Kollwitz drawing. Maybe it's blurry and not so visible here, but it represents a woman in front of mass of other women, and this woman in the front is falling down. The title of the drawing is Uprising, and this woman was shot by a bullet, we can suppose. So the sacrifice must be done, but the message, together with other articles in the same magazine issue, the message was that world anti-fascist action has to be undertaken now. For example, next to this article, there was the article with the title, "In France, is hard work done for the organizing women with the aim of state defense?" And then readers of Women Today should imagine what they should do now in their country. In the end, the last issue that has to be discussed here today, and I will have a few minutes more just for that, is that there were privileged periodical literary genres in Women Today, and these are reportage and short story, which is expected because this is also a literary journal. Here I want to accentuate that all described discourses and common topics were present in these genres, but with an enhanced emotional charge and with more complex meanings. My first example would be, however, the reportage, which does not have such complex and nuanced meaning. It is also unsigned reportage, a path to the liberty, a manual of worker rights. This article propagates trade unionism and is allegedly written by a woman, factory textile worker. It is one of the articles we now easily recognize to be written by some of the editors, and quasi-reportages like this served in the first place to formulate an explicit message, an instruction to young female workers how to practically protect their labor rights by joining up to the trade union. Contrary to that manner, and here's the other slide, contrary to that manner, in the short story with reportage elements, and the most short stories in Women Today were with reportage elements, an apprentice, Milka Zhicina, a proletarian writer and prominent contributor of Women Today, artistically wrote about an exploited young girl. This girl, this character, a girl around 13 years old, dreams of advancing from apprentice to worker. The story describes the multifold exploitation of the girl at a tailoring workshop of her female employer. This girl, Savka is her name, is doing her basic apprentice job, but besides that, she serves the employer in her private home, cleans the shop and the employer's house, cleans the room for the employer's subtenants, cleans after them, cleans their shoes, prepares them a breakfast. And she does all that after the learning hours. They are not just working hours, that should be learning hours because she's an apprentice. However, what makes this short story left feminist is that all of this is given from the girl's perspective. And in the original way, character reports it. She does not in a way that she just describes oppressions over her, but from the point of view, this is what will not happen when I become an officially and legally recognized worker with the working ID card. Then, although she will be exploited in a factory or at another tailor in a regular capitalist way, let's say like that, she would have her free time. So that's the key word, free time, which she does not have as an apprentice. And that is why the story begins with a description of a girl, Savka, watching from the workshop window on a balcony opposite her workshop, where another working girl is having a moment of free time. And that girl laughs at someone in the house. That girl is already freer than our character, Savka. Savka dreams about becoming that young woman soon. The story ends seemingly, I have to rephrase the story for this purpose, I'm sorry. The story ends seemingly in a tragic tone. Even when Savka becomes a worker, she finds no job in a factory or at another tailor's workshop, and she has to return to the same employer under the same working conditions. Despite that, reader is not left in pessimistic mode, because there is something new in the making of a female literary character, and something really powerful in the character's imaginative, utopian, and even aesthetic abilities. And that is what I labeled as becoming a political subject throughout this kind of left feminist literature, both as a writer and a reader. Even though the main character of the story does not rebel in the course of the story, given subjectivity calls for rebellion. Opposite to the first example, the non-authentic reportage, this story of Milka Zhicina is not burdened with the exclamations of revolutionary discourse and explicit messages, but Milka Zhicina sent the class revolutionary message with images that feed readers' imagination in the long run. So I will bring us to the conclusion now, and the time is left. With the example of this short story, one can recognize the literary phenomenon or process I would call editing, reporting, and imagining left feminism. Short stories in Woman Today and in other popular front feminist magazines always reported on real women's experiences. It only depends from one case to another whether was it closer to the newspaper reportage or to the fiction. Such a story gets its full meaning in relation to other articles of the magazine, and its left feminist ideology therefore is always, I would say, and we could say, edited. And one of its meaning in that sense is that after the revolution, such experiences of multifold oppression and exploitation will not be possible. So left feminism, to conclude, used to be imagined not in prescriptive images of how the future will look or should look, but rather through the realistic description of experience of a young woman. Yet in that description, there were signs of her consciousness, her subjectivity, and personal wishes and dreams. That is why, in the end, the anti-fascist Women's Front of Yugoslavia, ideologically prepared on the pages of Women Today, made a great success in World War II and after that, because it had taken young women of Yugoslavia as they were, and not as someone wanted to have them. And thank you for listening. That would be all.
Thank you so much, Stana. This is very rich and detailed talk. I really enjoyed it. I like how you opened it up for why this talk can have use value in today's world and in neoconservatist ideology and the way how we should struggle against. And you provided us with a very clear historical context that I really appreciate, kind of situating the magazine within the political and ideological climate of the print matters at the time, as well as you kind of walked us through the different facets of the Women's Today magazine, including, the genre that it featured, including its own mimicry strategies. That was very important to hear, specifically how this new way of meaning of enlightenment for revolution was carried out, as well as you discussed all these different topics and discourses, showing us how periodicals are, in a way, discursive sites worth looking into in order to gain a better picture of the cultural landscape in the country. So I'll open it up for questions. So please, those of you who are following us, jump in and ask questions. And in the meanwhile, I can ask also specific questions. But as I see, we now have one. Olivia Jenkins, our student here at Columbia, is asking and saying, thank you so much for your lecture. It was extremely interesting. You mentioned that Žena danas was more feminist than male party members had imagined. Do you know if there was any backlash or attempts at censorship and control from the party over the content of the periodical?
No, there wasn't the attempt of censorship or control in that period till the end of the running of the magazine. But after that, they realized that they let these women today really what they wanted. And at some communist conference in Yugoslavia, they said, now we will control what they do, what we will do in the future. It was in the same year the magazine was banned, but magazine already did what these women wanted. From the beginning, the idea of Male Comrade was to have a women's magazine, a women's journal, but it became feminist in a real sense. So what they succeed is to be women's and feminist in the same way, anti-fascist and communist. Really huge number of very educated and clever women gathered for the purpose of these magazines, and authors are from all the parts of Yugoslavia, from Slovenia, from Belgrade, from Bosnia and Herzegovina, and they were really, really clever and educated and knew what they do, and well, they were political subjects of their own, and this magazine shows it.
Thank you for answering that. While we're waiting for other questions, maybe I can jump in with my questions. So I like how you briefly touched on the Women's Anti-Fascist Front of Yugoslavia, that, as we know, after official narrative about it, was formed in 1942 and lasted until 1953. and it was one of the, the biggest mass organizations in former Yugoslavia. And I'm wondering, how does your talk and your research on the Women's Today magazine complicates or challenges is a story about the history and the development of the Women's Anti-Fascist Front? If you can say a few words about that.
Yes, it shows that anti-fascist Front of Women of Yugoslavia, in fact, was founded in this magazine, in this journal, we can say, and in a few more journals in Yugoslavia with similar name or different names, but they weren't so good as this was, and lasted much shorter. And the thing is, with these periodical studies, we can see it so easily that this was the predecessor or the Women's Anti-Fascist Front itself, only by reading the subtitle of the magazine, because in this period I was talking about, from 1936 until 1940, there was no subtitle of the magazine, of course, because it wanted to represent itself as a women's or feminist magazine, just like that, private publication. But when it was renewed in the war, there were three numbers published in the war on free territory when it was possible. And then it got the subtitle, Woman Today, an organ of the Anti-Fascist Women's Front of Yugoslavia. So just from that small gesture, as I also said in the lecture, when we use periodical studies as we should, we can read this simple fact that it was something before. But more than that, and which is really the most important thing, when we read the articles, all the articles carefully and analyze them and interpret them, then we see that the ideology of left feminism and also the anti-fascist front of women was put here in the magazine. Everything was prepared in the magazine, and what will happen in the war and right after the war in the revolutionary changes was already there, elaborated already in A Woman Today. And there's something, maybe it's too long answer, but there's something connected to the first question. The male comrades maybe saw the power of anti-fascist women's front after the war, and that's maybe the one of the reason it was of its dissolution in 1953. And there were polemics in Yugoslav history between feminist historians. Was it because of that or other reasons? But it's possible.
Yeah, maybe. Thank you for answering that. And maybe to follow up about what you said, it is interesting how much it is this whole story and narrative about the Women's Today magazine and the AFJ later on, Women's Anti-Fascist Front, how much that is connected with the party and party initiative to, use these strategies of mimicry to show that the magazine itself was not openly communist, but more feminist. So one of my questions would be, talking about the beginnings of the Women's World Committee Against War and Fascism, do we know how much that that organization that was led by the French president that you mentioned, Gabriel Jeunes, how much that organization was in connection to the Communist Party and the Soviet Union primarily? Do we know that? And also how much the 1953 stop or seizure of the Women's Anti-Fascist Front was connected to the split between Tito and Stalin, if you can say something about that.
Maybe the answer to the last question is no. And to the first, well, of course, all forces within the Popular Front were led by communist parties in their countries, and consequently by the Communist International in some way. So we are, and this was too, but we are still researching. I'm looking for already made works, and I mentioned Isidora Grubački, and there are some other researchers. So with this, we are trying to make maybe some international research project about this magazine, and then to see were they really autonomous, as we think they were. They were all connected to communist parties of their countries. It has to be like that. So the Communist Party was the main force in leading the Popular Front globally and anti-fascist struggle. But when we analyze particular texts, particular small ideologies under that, within that, we have to be, we can't just say it's like this or this. We have to research more on this issue.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I agree. And how much it is interesting for you as a researcher of periodicals to look at the Russian or USSR context, because many things that you mentioned specifically connected to the privileged genre, right? Reportage and short stories that use a lot of documentary materials are something that
Yes.
magazines, whether they are being illustrated or just written without that much images, very much were propagated in the Soviet context as well.
Yes, I read some Soviet magazines and US magazines of this kind. And for example, interesting thing is that at first in my PhD thesis, I thought the impact of Soviet Union is the most important one. But while researching this, I realized that European and US context and magazines had a great impact on our magazine and our left feminism, and especially when it comes to reportages and short stories. Agnes Medley, for example, the famous reporter and writer, left writer from America, United States, was one of the also prominent translated writers in Žena, danas. Her reportages and parts from other works were translated there. And this in the US context, the subject is well researched, the role of short stories and reportages in this revolutionary or just communist and national front activity in the second part of the 30s. There's, for example, an anthology, Writing Red, about where all these stories and reportages are collected. So now it's time to make the same thing on a totally global level, and to see that really women in different parts of the world did the same. And that was really internationally. We can't choose which and whose impact was bigger, from the Soviet Union or US and so
on. I understand. Yeah, that's a great response, because it's a confluence of factors, right? It's not only one, or and it seems to me that what in Yugoslav context, the Women Today magazine shared with their, Western European or American counterparts is that they were running some sort of underground or illegally, or they could not have an open call as it was the case in the Soviet Union.
Yes, yes. And it's totally different. So it's better to research these magazines in all other countries than in the Soviet Union.
Yeah. Which is also interesting because it makes it contemporary in a way of, the globalization movement that we're talking today.
Yes.
In the current situation.
Mm.
Well, I think, we can maybe end up here because I don't see any other questions from the audience. But thank you again, and thank everyone for following us. This will be also available later on YouTube, so you can revisit the lecture.
Thank you,
again,
Alexander, for inviting me.
Yeah. Okay, good luck with your future research.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.